Mormon founder Joseph Smith had over 30 secret wives, and some historians say it was over 40. And this is one of the darkest parts of the Mormon church, and it's a history that I didn't know 99% of until I left the church. Growing up as a devout Mormon kid, I was raised on stories about how Joseph and his first wife Emma were basically the perfect lovebirds. Emma was an elect lady, Joseph was a doting husband, and I basically assumed they were completely monogamous, which obviously couldn't be further from the truth. For example, Joseph Smith's youngest wife was 14 years old when he married her, and he was 38. And there are 7 other girls who were teenagers when he married them. Of Joseph Smith's wives, 11 of the women he married in secret were already married to living men at the time that they married Joseph Smith. Among these women, Joseph Smith also married a mother and a daughter, and then there were 3 sets of sisters, and Joseph Smith married all 3 sets of sisters. He also married his own foster daughters. These were girls who lived and worked within his home, and 5 of the girls he married fit this description of either being foster daughters or under his guardianship in some way. Joseph Smith's first polygamous wife, so his second wife after Emma, also worked in the home. Her name was Fanny Alger, and Oliver Cowdery, who Mormons will recognize as a scribe and witness to the Book of Mormon, described Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger as, quote, a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. I'm going to share more about the specifics of these different relationships in this video, but I'll also share what really rose to the surface while I was researching is how much patterns emerge as I'm looking into Joseph Smith's history with polygamy and how he related with these women. In the most chilling way, it reminds me of when you read or hear about a serial killer and they have a really specific way they go about completing their crimes. I feel like Joseph Smith is shockingly similar. When you go and read all of these girls' stories and what they said in affidavits, what they put in their journals, what they told to their friends, the ways in which Joseph Smith is approaching them are all shockingly similar. For example, a common thing that he would promise was their salvation as a reward for their wedding. He told one of his brides, if you take this step, it will ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation, and that of your father's household and all of your kindred. So he's basically saying, if you marry me in secret and become one of my polygamous wives, you are saved. You have salvation. Another common pattern is that Joseph Smith would say that an angel had threatened to kill Joseph Smith unless he practiced polygamy. And so he would go to one of these women and say, an angel has appeared to me 3 times with a flaming sword, and he said, if you don't agree to marry me, the angel will kill me. Similarly, Joseph Smith told his first wife Emma that if she did not accept polygamy as a true eternal doctrine, that God would destroy her. And that verse, that account of Joseph Smith telling his wife that she would be destroyed, is still found in the Doctrine and Covenants in the Mormon scriptures I used to carry around on my mission. And it's hard to underscore the level to which I venerated Joseph Smith. I grew up singing songs like Praise to the Man, Hail to the Prophet, Ascended to Heaven. I grew up going on vacation to go see these sites of where my religion had been founded. I saw the sacred grove. I went to Nauvoo. I literally went to the place where Joseph Smith was killed in Carthage Jail and put my finger through the bullet hole in the original door where he was killed and wrote that it was spiritual in my journal. And the level to which Mormons literally say that Joseph Smith is the second most important person to ever walk the planet, second only to Jesus Christ himself. And so I really cannot get through the camera the level to which Mormons view Joseph Smith as one of the most important people on the planet. And that's what makes reading about polygamy so harrowing and so difficult, especially for believing members, because it is simply inexcusable. It is simply disgusting and horrible. Apologetics works so hard to try to make Joseph Smith's polygamy more palatable, but as we're gonna get into today, it is impossible to make this man out to be a good person after reading and sharing what I'm going to share with you today. Mormons have such a high opinion of Joseph Smith that there's even an entire movement to say that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy at all, and that this is all just a smear campaign against the prophet's name. And this is even though the church has fully and completely admitted, finally, they took a while to get there, but they have now admitted that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. And if you look at this essay, which is published on the church's website, it says the exact number of women to whom he was sealed in his lifetime is unknown because the evidence is fragmentary. And if you click on the footnote, they make you click on the footnote, of course, because they're trying to bury the information while being as truthful as possible. But if you click on that little footnote, you can see in my screenshot, it says off to the side, careful estimates put the number between 30 and 40. You know that this history is messy when careful estimates place the number of wives between 30 and 40. So there's 10 wives that even careful estimates can't technically fully account for. But even though obviously this information is available on the church website, as you can tell from this footnote situation, they do make it very difficult for members to find this. You're not going to find this essay that I'm screenshotting here in church manuals. You're not going to find it in Sunday school manuals or as like a specific topic that should be discussed on a particular Sunday. You really have to go searching for this information if you want to find it. The church is not forthcoming by any stretch of the imagination. Researching this type of history is also just notoriously difficult when, first, polygamy was just illegal, so they were doing it in secret. It's a lot of he said, she said. So Joseph Smith would write in a journal that he was not practicing polygamy, and he hasn't said in the Doctrine and Covenants, I'm not practicing polygamy. And then there's contemporary documents which have his secretary carefully transcribing his wives, their names, and the dates of their marriages. And so depending on what resources you're choosing to look at, it can be very difficult to eke out what actually happened and the extent of the relationships. Also in the 1800s, which is when all of this was happening, sex was completely taboo. And so a lot of times they'll allude to certain things, but they don't use specific words because it just was a different time. And so that also makes it difficult to figure out what exactly happened. And I'll note that when I read these documents, often they use the word the principle. So Joseph Smith didn't usually call it polygamy. Sometimes it was called plural marriage, but usually as he's approaching these women, he refers to it as teaching them the principle. And whenever I talk to FLDS people or read about FLDS people, they still call polygamy the principle in FLDS communities. And so the principle was the term for the doctrine. And polygamy wasn't even publicly announced in the church until Brigham Young had the Saints in Utah, which was at that point just Mexican territory. And so for a lot of the founding of the church, this was also hidden from most of the membership of the church, and that's how secretive it was. There are accounts where two sisters get married to Joseph Smith, and they don't even know the other girl, their own sister, is married to Joseph Smith because they're so sworn to secrecy. Before we continue, go ahead and brew yourself a cup of devil's bean juice because this one is a doozy. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and drop a comment if you have a question about Joseph Smith's polygamy. To share my analysis of Joseph Smith as an ex-member and as someone who's spent a lot of time researching him, I think he was a highly charismatic man who found out very early on that it was easy to get people to believe him. So he said he could find buried treasure. People gave him money to go find buried treasure. He said he found gold plates. People believed him. He said he translated the gold plates into the Book of Mormon. People believed him. He said he saw an angel. People believed him. And so I think when he got caught with his first wife, Fanny Alger, who was actually just a live-in maid who he groomed, I think that he saw an opportunity to make people believe him just like they had believed him in the past, and to use religious language and use his charisma to get off scot-free. And so I think that basically Joseph Smith just wanted to sleep with a lot of women. I think he wanted to exert power over them and their husbands and the people around them. And he did that by claiming that God had told him that this was okay, that it was celestial marriage ordained of God. And because he had this track record of continuously getting people to get on his side and believe him, it worked. At least it worked for a while until he was killed. I think that when he was caught with Fanny Alger, he invented the doctrine of polygamy as a cover. And the doctrine of polygamy is still found in Mormon scripture. These are my scriptures from when I was in the church in Doctrine and Covenants 132. And so it definitely is still enshrined in Mormon scripture. And it's still part of the belief that in the afterlife, a man can have multiple wives and a woman can only have one husband, which is what I talked about in this video. And so I think that that's how we see Joseph Smith take what was the early Mormon church and turn it into a secretive polygamy cult. Because in the final years before his death, he was marrying tons of women in secret. And there was a newspaper that was printed in Nauvoo that was attempting to call him out. And it was written all by former members of the church, one of which had been in the first presidency. And this newspaper, I'm going to read a quote. It says, "It is absurd for men to assert that all is well, while wicked and corrupt men are seeking our destruction by a perversion of sacred things. For all is not well, while whoredoms and all manner of abominations are practiced under the cloak of religion. Lo, the wolf is in the fold, arrayed in sheep's clothing, and is spreading death and devastation among the saints." So Joseph Smith is the wolf in sheep's clothing. I also wanted to note that I do think words matter a lot here, and I truly don't agree with the characterization that a 14-year-old marries a 38-year-old in a secret polygamous ceremony and that we should call that marriage. If, for another example, a 16-year-old girl was employed in someone's home and it was discovered that the father of the home or the man of the home was having sex with her, we would not call that marriage either. We would call that rape, grooming, child sexual assault. Those are the words that much more accurately describe what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Using words like marriage or union or love to describe what Joseph Smith was doing gives him so much more credibility and honor than he deserves. Because even with a historical lens, what he was doing was illegal, immoral, and despicable. And so even though in this video I will use some of the historical words to describe what was going on, I don't accept it, and I'm going to be adding my own opinions about how we should look back on these things, but I'll try to use both just to speak to the history and to give what I think is the more deserved interpretation. And at the end of the day, there's just simply no excusing this behavior. He had between 30 and 40 secret wives. So any attempt to normalize this with the lens of history or to say, oh, because he did it in this way, it was okay, is obviously just an apologist attempt to make Joseph Smith seem like he was a good person when if you just read the historical accounts, it's hard to hold the opinion that he was good. To show you some of the resources I'll be pulling from today, and I've already included some screenshots from them. If you want to research yourself, all of this will be in the links below. This is a long list and summary of the different wives. It also lists them chronologically. This is an easy one-pager that includes some of the wives that just shows some of the different categories, like the teenage brides, the women who were already married to other men. This is a very interesting resource. It has a ton of primary sources, specifically affidavits signed to confirm the marriages. This page shows evidence of sexual relations and how compelling or how strong the evidence is that he had sex with the different women listed on this website. If you want to read a book about the life of Joseph Smith, you can check out No Man Knows My History. She does go into polygamy in this book. I think the most extensive and best resource for polygamy specifically is In Sacred Loneliness, which is written from a faithful perspective, but includes a lot of the disfavorable accounts. And the problem with when you're trying to research this as a young Mormon kid or as a teenager trying to decide to go on a mission is that almost all of the resources you can find about this stuff is either from ex-members who, as a Mormon kid, you immediately don't want to listen to anything they have to say and think that they're just trying to discredit the church, or from faithful perspectives, which are obviously just trying to convince you that Joseph Smith's polygamy was a-okay. And so it can be really difficult to try to sift through all of this information because because all of it feels like it's trying to get you to have a specific perspective. And so obviously, you're getting the ex-Mormon perspective from me. Those resources I listed, though, a lot of them include primary sources. I feel like that was all I could cling to as I was trying to make a decision and learn about Joseph Smith's polygamy. Was I just want a primary source. But even primary sources can be difficult because a lot of them were written 30 years after the event, or by an ex-member 30 years after the event, or by a believing member. And so it's really hard to feel like your entire life of being Mormon hinges on the truth of Joseph Smith being a good person or not, and then to realize how much of the information is kind of tainted by bias. And so, like I said, obviously, my position. Feel free to look at the resources I compiled below. Feel free also to look at the church's approved website and what they had to say about it, and do your own research, as they say. I'm going to now jump into some of the specific relationships within his polygamy. We'll start with his first wife, Emma, go to Fanny Alger, and go from there. I'll also share a little bit of the church history that was happening along the way, because it does matter quite a bit for why his polygamy really amped up over the later years of his life. For example, in 1842, he married 11 women. In 1843, he married 17 women, and then he died in 1844. So it really ramped up from his first wife. And so let's jump into Joseph Smith's path from being a teenage boy treasure digging in New York to a polygamous cult leader in Nauvoo, Illinois. Joseph Smith's first wife was Emma Smith, and they got married in 1827. And this is the wife that I grew up hearing stories about, seeing paintings of, the loving embraces, just how they were just perfect for each other. And I think looking more closely at their relationship really foreshadows Joseph Smith's behavior of what was to come, because Emma's parents were vehemently against them getting married, and her dad did not give Joseph Smith permission, specifically because he had already been arrested for treasure digging. Even though her parents were against it, Joseph Smith whisked Emma away and married her in secret. And I'm going to read a portion of what Emma Smith's dad said after he finally gets to see Emma again after the wedding has taken place. This is a quote from Isaac Hale, so this is Emma's dad. Hale met the couple in a flood of tears. "You have stolen my daughter and married her," he cried. "I had much rather have followed her to her grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people." And so you can really hear the vitriol in Emma's dad's what he's saying. He's like, I'd rather have her die than be married to you. And so the fact that Joseph Smith still went through with this despite this opposition, and he basically just took what he wanted, it really foreshadows his willingness to just say, I'm going to get what I want, and I'm not listening to anyone else's opinion, and how he was going to continue to do that with other women. I also think the secrecy element here matters a lot too, because most of Joseph Smith's secretive polygamous relationships with these other women, most of those were secret from Emma. So his first wife didn't know. So just like Emma's marriage to Joseph was a secret from her parents, it also was foreshadowing the fact that Joseph Smith's marriages to all these other women would be secrets from Emma too. This brings us to his first polygamous wife, Fanny Alger. I think a young person being groomed and assaulted is a more accurate way to describe this relationship. The power imbalance between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger is shocking. She was working in the home basically as a maid, and estimates put her around 16, 17, or 18. It's not clear specifically how old she was at the time of this relationship. Joseph Smith would have been 27 when they got married in 1833, and this took place in Kirtland, Ohio. There are 4 different accounts that talk about this relationship. One is from Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery helped Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon. He was a witness to the Book of Mormon. He was really one of the earliest believers in Joseph Smith as a prophet, and polygamy was one of the primary reasons that him and Joseph Smith had a falling out. And as I said, he described this relationship as a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. Another man named William McClellan recounted a conversation he had with Emma Smith about the Fanny Fanny Alger relationship. William said that Emma had recounted to him that one night she, Emma, missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story too was verily true. Another man named Chauncey Webb also recounts Emma's discovery of this relationship. He said Emma was furious and drove the girl, who was unable to conceal the consequences of her celestial relation with the prophet, out of her house. If you read between the lines there, you may have caught that it seems like they're insinuating that Fanny Alger was pregnant. Based on the history, it's unclear what happened with this insinuation. There's not evidence that she did give birth, or any DNA testing has confirmed that any of her future children were related to Joseph Smith. Another woman named Anne Eliza spoke about the fact that Emma had kicked Fanny Alger out of the house, and she said, "It was felt that Emma certainly must have had some very good reason for her action. By degrees it became whispered about that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was by no means a paternal affection, and his wife, discovering the fact, at once took measures to place the girl beyond his reach." A note there too that it says adopted daughter. Nothing else I found says that he had literally adopted her, as much as she was just working within the home. But obviously this is part of the pattern I already pointed out, which is that he would have young girls in his home as foster daughters or helpers or guardians of some kind, and then he would use that proximity as a way to sleep with them or to marry them, whatever you want to say. And with Fanny Alger, we have our first instance of Joseph Smith using his power to coerce a girl to marry him. I think another reason that this relationship is so significant is that Joseph Smith said that he received the authority from God to seal people, the sealing keys, in 1836. So this is basically him saying, in 1836, I received permission to do celestial marriages. So he has this special power to have eternal marriages, which is also the power that was used to marry me to my husband for time and all eternity. And so the reason that this matters is that if the authority from God to perform these marriages, whether it's a polygamous marriage or just a marriage for time and all eternity, he didn't get that permission from God by his own account until 1836, and Fanny Alger was in 1833. So even by his own account, he is acting outside of the permission of God with this first relationship with Fanny. By his own admission, he did not have authority to marry her in a polygamous relationship, even within his own twisted doctrine. And so I think that that also shows that he really truly was just using his authority to groom a young girl and sleep with her. He was not acting as a prophet, as so many apologists would have you believe. And I think one of the reasons that talking about polygamy can be so frustrating is the apologist take of how they try to bend over backwards to make Joseph Smith look like a moral person. A common defense is that an age gap relationship back then was considered normal. So even if Joseph Smith was 35 and he marries a 16-year-old, oh, that was normal for the time. When in reality, all polygamy was illegal. They're like, well, if he married, an age gap relationship like that was so normal. And the truth is that none of this was normal even for the time. As soon as he took a second wife, as soon as he even slept with a woman that wasn't his wife, none of this is typical for the 1800s or now. It is all amoral. It is all atypical. And really, the apologists just tell on themselves because they work so hard to make Joseph Smith look good when what he was actually doing is really simply just evil. To read another portion of the Nauvoo Expositor where they are outing Joseph Smith for his polygamy, it says, "How shall he who has drank the poisonous draught teach virtue? In the stead thereof, when the criminal ought to plead guilty to the court is obliged to plead guilty to the criminal." And that perfectly encapsulates how I feel reading apologistic thinking about this. It's like we have to corrupt our own morality to accept his immorality. And that's why so many people leave the church over this issue. Because if they just kind of squint their eyes and sneeze, they'll find information that shows how bad of a person, how evil of a person Joseph Smith was. There are many different ways faithful Mormons try to explain away Joseph Smith's polygamy, one of which is that they say he never had sex with any of these women, even though the women themselves went on record to say that they did sleep with him. Another explanation is that because Joseph Smith never lived with these women, it's proof that these sealings were just religious ceremonies and they were just kind of for show or for eternity. There was nothing sexual about them. And because the women continued to live in many cases with their husbands that they were already married to, that it shows that everything was above board. And one of the women actually spoke to this point specifically, and I thought this was pretty interesting. Of the arrangement, she later wrote, "I could tell you why I stayed with Mr. Leitner, her original husband. She said things the current leaders of the church do not know anything about. I did just as Joseph told me to do." And so she's saying that basically the reason she didn't live with Joseph Smith is because he told her to keep it a secret because they were doing something illegal. And so it's not like they didn't go cohabitate with Joseph Smith because he was a good dude. They didn't cohabitate with Joseph Smith because they were doing something illegal, and cohabitation is a great way to out the fact that you're a polygamist. And so apologists aside, because obviously they're going to use whatever mental gymnastics it takes in order to feel like Joseph Smith was still a good person, but to give a little bit more history as to the Mormons' migration, because where they were actually had a pretty big impact on polygamy. In the 1830s, they were trying to set up and establish Zion in Missouri, but they were met with a lot of opposition, somewhat because they would just show up to towns and be like, God gave us this land, even if there were already people living there. They did that a lot. They did that with the Native Americans too, whenever they got to Utah. But by the end of the 1830s, they started facing more and more resistance. And so in 1838, Governor Boggs, the governor of Missouri, issued an extermination order against the Mormons. And Joseph Smith was on the run. They left Missouri and they said, let's start our own thing over in Nauvoo, Illinois. Nauvoo actually started as a city called Commerce, but was taken over by the Mormons and they renamed it Nauvoo, and that was 1839. And this is why polygamy got so out of hand at this point in Nauvoo, because Joseph Smith really had a monopoly over the town. He was the mayor of Nauvoo. He was obviously the prophet of the church. He was the editor of the newspaper, the Times and Seasons. He was the justice of the peace. He was the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, which was about 2,000 to 3,000 troops. And so really, he had unilateral power in Nauvoo. He was everything to everyone, whether it was in the government or the religion. And so in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith really had a level of power that he had not had throughout this entire time of founding the church. And he was easily able to use that power to accrue more polygamist wives. What's also crazy is that between about 1842 and 1844, Nauvoo had a population that was rivaling Chicago, and that was about 12,000 people. And so the Mormons were really gaining a lot of mass very, very quickly, and with more people in the congregation or within this city, Joseph Smith is going to have more power. It was also while in Nauvoo that Joseph Smith announced that he was going to run for the president of the United States. And so he wasn't just trying to be the leader of Nauvoo, he wanted even more power. Now that Joseph Smith has his own town, he also starts introducing the principle of polygamy to the men around him, and using polygamy, in my opinion, as a way to get favor and to have the men around him do what he wants. And it was really just his very tight inner circle. Like I said, it wasn't the whole church. There's also this signed affidavit from a man named William Clayton. Mormons may know him as the man who wrote the words for "Come, come ye saints." And he recounts the prophet teaching him the principle of polygamy. Joseph Smith basically approaches William Clayton and notes that William seems to have taken fancy for this girl. And Joseph Smith says to send for her. And William says, why would she listen to me? I have no authority. authority over her, and that's when Joseph Smith teaches him the principle of polygamy. To this, Joseph Smith, answered, "I give you the authority to send for her, and I will furnish you the means," which he did. This was the first time the prophet Joseph Smith talked with me on the subject of plural marriage. He informed me that the doctrine and principle was right in the sight of our Heavenly Father, and that it was a doctrine which pertained to the celestial order and glory. After giving me lengthy instructions and information concerning the doctrine of celestial plural marriage, he concluded his remarks by the words, "It's your privilege to have all the wives you want." He goes on to say that he also informed me, so Joseph Smith said he had other wives living besides his first wife Emma, and then he goes on to list a few names, and others were his lawful wives in the sight of heaven. And so I also encountered this a lot in my research, where Joseph Smith teaches other men about polygamy and offers them wives as basically rewards for being part of his inner circle. The next marriage I wanted to highlight is the stories of Heber C. Kimball and Helen Mar Kimball. Heber C. Kimball was Helen Mar Kimball's dad, and Joseph Smith basically comes to Heber C. Kimball and says, "Hey, Heber, I'm gonna marry your wife." Heber was completely crushed, and he didn't eat for a few days, no eating or drinking. He's like fasting and praying about it because he doesn't want to give up his wife to Joseph Smith. And finally, he decides that he's going to just go along with it. And so finally, after a few days, Heber takes his wife named Valete to Joseph Smith and says, "Okay, I'm going to let you do it." And Joseph Smith then says, "It was all a test all along, and I don't want your wife after all, and I just wanted to make sure that you were really loyal to me." And I mean, just crazy levels of manipulative, obviously, seeing if he would just be willing to do his bidding. And apparently this test of faith worked out really quite well for Heber, because he would eventually go on to marry his own 39 wives. And so that test with Heber and Valete took place in 1841, and less than 2 years later, Joseph Smith comes back to Heber C. Kimball and says, "Okay, now I want your daughter, Helen Mar Kimball, but this time it's for real." And Helen Mar Kimball was 14 years old at this point. Helen Mar Kimball said that Joseph Smith taught her that if you will take this step, marrying Joseph Smith, it will ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation, and that of your father's household and all your kindred. And so he's literally saying that if she wants eternal salvation for herself and her whole family, she needs to go along with this. Helen also said this about her father arranging the marriage. She said, "Having a great desire to be connected with the prophet Joseph Smith, he, her dad, offered me up to him. This I afterward learned from the prophet's own mouth. My father had but one ewe lamb, but willingly laid her upon the altar." So she's also describing herself as being laid on the altar as a sacrifice that is it's a transaction in order to get exaltation and salvation. So that essay I showed you from earlier that is directly from the church talking about Joseph Smith's polygamy, it doesn't go in depth into almost any of these relationships. It's a very high-level apologetic overview, but it does mention Helen Mar Kimball specifically. And I think that the way they speak about this relationship, which is she's a 14-year-old being gifted by her daddy to Joseph Smith, is shocking. So this is what they say. "The youngest was Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Joseph's closest friends, who was sealed to Joseph several months before her 15th birthday." And I'm not sure that saying several months before a 15th birthday would hold up in court. I just think it's so interesting that they literally chose to redact her true age, which was 14, and instead chose to describe it as being several months before her 15th birthday so that they don't have to write the number 14 in this article, even though she was 14. So just say she was 14. It goes on to say that marriage at such an age, inappropriate by today's standards, was legal in that era. Was it legal for Joseph Smith to marry Helen Mar Kimball as his polygamous wife, though? She was around his 25th wife. So at this point, nothing about this is normal or legal. But it's almost like they want to, they love using this like it was a different time argument to soften the blow of the fact that Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old, and it was his best friend's daughter who gave his daughter to Joseph Smith. They're really working overtime to describe this in a way that isn't as horrible as it truly was. Next, I wanted to highlight the story of Zena Huntington. She was married to Joseph Smith in 1841, and she was pregnant when Joseph Smith married her. Zena was married to a man named Henry, and apparently even before she married Henry, Joseph Smith had been trying to get Zena to marry him. In Zena's biography, it talks about when Zena married Henry, and apparently the prophet Joseph Smith was supposed to marry them, and he didn't show up. It says, after a wait, they decided to ask the clerk if he would perform the marriage, which he did. When the couple later met the prophet, Zena asked him why he hadn't come as he had promised. The prophet told her that it had been made known to him that she was to be his celestial wife, and he could not give to another one who had been given to him. So to me, he's basically stomping his feet, not showing up to the wedding, because he wants Zena to marry him, and so he's refusing to participate in the wedding or allow them to get married by his authority or by his hand, because he thinks that she should belong to him. After Zena married Jacob, Joseph Smith asked her to marry him again, and this time used really threatening language. So he basically said the line about how an angel with a flaming sword was going to kill him unless she agreed to marry him. In this article is so condemning, in my opinion. In this section, it lists all the times that Joseph Smith used this angel with a drawn sword explanation as to why the women should marry him. It says, Zena told brother Joseph's remark in relation to the revelation on celestial marriage, how an angel came to him with a drawn sword, and he said if he did not obey the law, he would lose his priesthood, and in the keeping of it, he, Joseph, did not know, but it would cost him his life. In another account, he said that the angel would cause him to lose my position and my life. And so about 7.5 months into Zena's marriage to Henry, she is secretly sealed or married to Joseph Smith, and at the time she was 6 months pregnant. And what's particularly damning about this specific relationship is that in the rules for polygamy outlined in the Doctrine and Covenants in 132, it says the justification for polygamy is to multiply and replenish the earth and to bear the souls of men. And it's pretty obvious by the fact that she was 6 months pregnant that she didn't need any extra help multiplying and replenishing the earth when she was currently pregnant with the baby of her first relationship. And as I said at the top, Joseph Smith married 11 women who were already married to other men. And so even just by his own actions, he is defying the God-given rules as stated in the Doctrine and Covenants 132. Those women don't need any help multiplying and replenishing the earth when they already have husbands. The next relationship I wanted to highlight happens in 1842. So you can see that these are all coming very closely together. And this is the relationship between Joseph Smith, Miranda Hyde, and Orson Hyde. And Joseph Smith's history with Miranda actually goes back to before Fanny Alger. And this is also kind of a crazy thing to realize, is that Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered back in 1832. And several different scholars and books say that the reason he was tarred and feathered is that he was being inappropriate with a girl, they'd call her the Johnson girl. It's Miranda Johnson, who was staying with the family in 1832. So this is a year before Fanny Alger. And this is the same pattern of Joseph using his position of having a young girl in his home as a way to groom her and sleep with her and assault her. And so this same Miranda, this woman, is Mormon. She goes on to marry a man named Orson Hyde, but Joseph Smith has not forgotten about her because he continues to pursue her just like he pursued her back in 1832, more than 10 years earlier. And wouldn't you know it, Joseph Smith gets a revelation that he should send Orson Hyde on a mission to Jerusalem, very far away. This is another pattern, sending men away so that he can do whatever he wants. So he sends Orson away, and while Orson is away, Miranda has 2 kids, and she's living in squalor, not being very well provided for. And this is where Joseph Smith swoops back in and says, "You're going to be my polygamist wife." Joseph Smith writes down this revelation he receives about taking Miranda as his plural wife. He says, "Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph, that inasmuch as you have called upon me to know my will concerning my handmaid, Nancy Miranda Hyde, behold, it is my will that she should have a better place prepared for her than that in which she now lives. Now let my handmaid, Nancy Miranda Hyde, hearken unto the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things, whatsoever he shall teach unto her." So he teaches her the principle of polygamy. He shares this revelation that she's supposed to come live with him, and she becomes one of his plural wives while concurrently being married to a man who's on a mission in Jerusalem. And it's not clear that he ever had knowledge of this union. The next woman I wanted to cover is named Mary Lightner, and her marriage to Joseph Smith was in 1842, also in Nauvoo. Her story is very interesting because she wrote a lot of firsthand accounts, whereas a lot of these women, we don't have their own experience of what it was like to get married, or we just have very brief snippets, not whole paragraphs. The first time Joseph Smith lets Mary know that she's going to be his plural wife is when she's 12 years old. But the union doesn't happen at that point. But it says here, 12-year-old Mary remembers, "He told me about his great vision concerning me. He said I was the first woman God commanded him to take as a plural wife." She said that over the next few years, he continued to ask her to marry him. In 1834, he was commanded to take me for a wife. Mary also said Joseph told her, "The angel came to me 3 times between the year of 34 and 42 and said I was to obey that principle or he would slay me." So here we have again the angel that's threatening Joseph, because that's how our loving Heavenly Father works, by sending an angel to say, "I'm going to kill you if you don't marry teenage girls." Joseph also said that I was his before I came here. So basically God had foreordained her to be one of his polygamist wives. And he said that all the devils in hell should never get me from him. And I should have said this at the top, that by the time Joseph Smith married Mary, she was already married to another man. And it said, Mary said her husband Adam was far away out of town at the time of her marriage to Joseph. And so, same pattern, he's sending the men away, he's getting them out of town, he's disfellowshipping them, he's removing them from the picture so that he can marry their wives. And so obviously Joseph Smith finally wears her down after years of telling her she's going to marry him. And she even said that she tried to pray to get a witness or some sort of revelation that polygamy was part of God's plan. She said, "If ever a poor mortal prayed, I did." And finally, after all these years, Joseph Smith convinced her. And she's also the one that explained that the reason she didn't go live with Joseph Smith was because it was against the law. And so she continued to live with her first husband, but was secretly married to Joseph Smith. Next, I wanted to highlight Lucy Walker. She's one of the ones that she's on this chart as having strong evidence that her relationship with Joseph Smith included having sex. Lucy Walker was Joseph Smith's foster daughter. This was a very common pattern, whether they were working in the home or he had elected to have these girls as his foster daughters. Her story is so sad. Her mother passed away, and then, of course, Joseph Smith sent her dad on a mission. So she now is parentless. Usually missions, even back then, would last for 2 to 3 or more years. And it's at this point that Joseph Smith, now that she's isolated and alone and completely dependent on him as her foster father, that he reveals that she is to be one of his wives. He said that marriage was a command from God, and that if she refused the gate of heaven, the gate will be closed forever against you. She initially refused, which most of the women seem to initially refuse. And then she had 2 sleepless nights. She said she wanted to die. The quote is, "I was to all intents and purposes as one dead to the world. I wish that the grave would receive me, for the love of heaven was lost to me. And thus I prayed in the agony of my soul," is another quote. And so this isn't obviously revealing that she was so happy to be part of Joseph Smith's polygamist cult. She was incredibly sad. So sad that she didn't even want to live. And it really makes you question, this apologistic thinking where it's like, oh, Joseph Smith just wanted to be with all of these women in heaven, and it was a way to ensure that they were part of his eternal family. But obviously, if he wanted to be with her in heaven, why not just seal him to her as a daughter rather than as a wife? And if he's not going to have sex with her, why does she want to die? She literally, as you can see here, later testified it did include sexual relations. And so this is from top to bottom. I do not know, like all of these relationships, I do not know how anyone who could read this would still view Joseph Smith as a holy man. He is a scoundrel that is using his power to manipulate young girls who have been left in his care to sleep with him, to sexually assault them. And truly, in almost every story I've described, there is some element where Joseph Smith makes the woman reliant on him, either by sending her husband on a mission, or having her as a foster daughter, or hiring to work as like a childcare helper or maid of some kind within his home. And his ability to use his power to get women into his clutches, women and girls, into his clutches and coerce them into these acts, it's truly harrowing to read about and to even have to picture or consider as the reality and the foundation of the religion I was once a part of. The final two stories I'm going to share are both similarly girls who had been placed in Joseph Smith's care, who he then married while they were in his home. This dynamic where Joseph Smith uses his position of having girls or women in his home and then using that proximity to marry them, or I would say groom them and have sex with them. This is also the case for the Partridge sisters, who he married in March of 1843. So here we have another case in which their father died. He was the first bishop of the church, Edward Partridge. He died in 1840. And so after he died, the Partridge sisters moved into the Smith household to help with childcare and other domestic chores. After they lived there for about a year, we have this recounting from Emily Partridge, and she said, "In the spring of 1842, Joseph said to me one day, 'Emily, if you will not betray me, I will ask you something for your benefit.' Of course I would keep his secret. He's the prophet. He asked me if I would burn it if he would write me a letter. I began to think that this was not the proper thing for me to do, and I was about as miserable as I ever wished to be. I went into my room and knelt down and asked my Father in heaven to direct me. At Joseph's insistence, I could not speak to anyone on earth. I received no comfort till I went back to say I could not take a private letter from him." So he's like, "I want to write you a letter that you're going to be my wife." He asked me if I wished the matter ended, and I said I did. Emily recalls, "He said no more to me for many months." So just like same patterns we've seen in previous stories. He asks them, they say no, and then he continues to badger them and insist upon it and elevate and escalate until finally they say yes. Emily Partridge was asked explicitly about her sexual relationship with Joseph Smith, and this is what she said. Question: "Did you ever have carnal intercourse with Joseph Smith?" Answer: "Yes, sir." Question: "How many nights?" "I could not tell you." "Did you make the declaration that you ever slept with him but one night?" "Yes, sir." "And was that the only time and place that you were ever in bed with him?" "No, sir." And so basically they slept together on their wedding night, and she seems to be also saying that they slept together at other times. He had sex with her at other times. It wasn't at night. So I think that this was also happening quite a bit too, where he was sneaking around and waiting for a brief opportunity, confronting the girl or woman and saying, "We've got 5 minutes." And that was the way he was able to carry on these relationships, even though they didn't always live together. At the time of their marriage, Emily was 19 and he was 37, though obviously he had been asking her to marry him before she was 19. He also propositioned and secretly married her sister. So we have Emily Partridge and Eliza Partridge. Eliza was 22 at the time of their marriage, and he was 37. His marriage to Eliza literally took place 4 days after he married her sister. Eliza wrote about her experience with Joseph Smith and said, "While living in Joseph's house, he taught to us the plan of celestial marriage and asked us to enter into that order with him. This was truly a great trial for me, but I had the most implicit confidence in him as a prophet of the Lord and could not believe his words, and as a matter of course, accept the privilege of being sealed to him for time and all eternity." So obviously, if you read between the lines there, she's saying, I didn't want to do it, but he was the prophet, and so I did. She's the one that later said that between Emily and Eliza, they kept the secret from each other about the marriages. And she said, "Neither of us knew about the other at the time. Everything was so secret." You can read it in this page that her relationship with Joseph Smith included sex. Another reason why the Partridge sisters are so notable is how they interfaced with Emma's story. So, like I said, Emma really didn't know most of these relationships were happening. And it was around this time that Joseph Smith instituted the endowment ceremony, which I've talked about, and I did, as when I was Mormon before my mission. The cloak, the veil, the robes, the green apron. Joseph Smith was inventing that or stealing it from Masonry around this time. And without the endowment ceremony, you're not going to go to the celestial kingdom. And he told Emma that she could not get her endowment. He wanted her to be the first woman to get it, but he said, "You can't get this special ceremony until you tell me I can be a polygamist, until you tell me that you're okay with these relationships." And at this point, she still thinks it's theoretical from what it seems. And so she's still thinking he's basically theoretically saying, hey, God is telling me to do this, I got to do it. She doesn't know that at this point he has 20 plus brides. And so finally, because she wants to get her endowment ceremony, she says, "I will allow you to practice polygamy, but I would like to choose who you get to be with." And so Emma chooses the Partridge sisters, who are currently living with them. Emily Partridge spoke to this specifically, and she said, "I do not know why she, Emma, gave us to him, unless she thought we were where she could watch us better." And so basically Emily is thinking, well, maybe Emma said we could be with him because if we're all under the same roof, she can know what's going on and maybe feel more in control. It's after Emma gives this permission that Joseph Smith can marry the Partridge sisters that they literally get remarried to him while Emma is there. So they married him in secret, and then they fake a new secret wedding ceremony again, so that Emma can be there and witness it, and Emma thinks it's the first time any of this is happening. According to this, just 1 week later, Emma got to do her endowment ceremony. And so once again, we have a situation where Joseph Smith uses his power of convincing, his charisma, whatever, to dangle a carrot in front of someone and to say, if you want to get the thing you want, you need to do what I want first. And so the endowment is the carrot, and Emma finally says, fine, have the wives if I get to have this other spiritual gift that you're withholding from me until I say yes. But unsurprisingly, the Partridge sisters aren't the only sisters Joseph Smith married. We also have the Lawrence sisters. Sarah was 17 when Joseph Smith married her, and Maria was 20. And this happened in 1843. When their father, Edward Lawrence, died in 1840, of course, seeing Joseph Smith as the prophet and leader of the town, their dad had left them and their inheritance and their care in the hands of Joseph Smith and another man named William Law. William Law at this point was the first counselor in the presidency, and so he was basically, religiously speaking, Joseph Smith's right-hand man. Maria's friend wrote down a conversation that she had had with Maria during this time, and she said, Maria suffered her doubts, her fears, and her uncertainty as to whether she was acting right or wrong for saying she had a conscience and wanted to be right. She also remembers Maria saying, if there was any truth in Mormonism, she would be saved, for my yoke has not been easy, nor my burden light. And I think if we read between the lines there, we can easily see that she didn't want to do it. And just like a lot of these other women and girls, she was willing to make the sacrifice. She's viewing this as a sacrifice she's making to God to follow a law that she does not feel good about. William Law's accounting of this relationship between Joseph Smith and his foster daughters is also very telling, because it's clear that someone, an adult in the room, had a conscience and was going to say something about it, because William didn't know polygamy was going on until the Lawrence sisters got married to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith basically finally let William Law in on this plural marriage situation. This is what William said when he found out that Joseph Smith was practicing polygamy, aka grooming women and girls. He said, "William, with his arms around the neck of the prophet and tears streaming down his face, pleaded with him to withdraw the doctrine of plural marriage." Joseph Smith said he couldn't, and as a result, he kicked William Law from the first presidency. So he kicked him out of the church leadership because he had raised such a fuss about what Joseph Smith was doing. As a result, William finally decided to sue Joseph Smith, and he took him to court and filed a lawsuit for living in an open state of adultery with Maria Lawrence. I found this interview with William Law, which happened after the death of Joseph Smith, and they asked him a lot of really specific questions. Members would discount him because Joseph Smith disfellowshipped him and basically kicked him out of the church. William Law also wrote the Nauvoo Expositor, which led to the death of Joseph Smith. And so obviously William Law is a controversial character among faithful believers, but I highly recommend reading through this interview. They ask him if he's heard of abortion being practiced in Nauvoo. He also talks about the Lawrence sisters. They ask him about robberies and crimes and money. They ask him a lot of really specific questions that people have about the church during this phase. And considering William Law was in the first presidency, I think that if you believe what he's saying, I think he probably knows what he's talking about. This is where we get to the part in this story where Joseph Smith's polygamy and his inability to stop being a monster leads to his death. As I said, William Law seemed to be one of the only people in this whole story with a conscience, and after he did his lawsuit, he also decided to publish an expose about Joseph Smith's polygamy, and this was called the Nauvoo Expositor. I've read a couple of lines from it already. I always love reading about the OG ex-Mormons because I feel like I have a lot of camaraderie as an ex-member myself who is outspoken. So you can see here the list of the people who participated in the publication of the Nauvoo Expositor. And this is a newspaper that had literally one issue because it caused so many problems within this Mormon community. You'll see William Law listed first here, but every name listed is an ex-member who was coming out publicly against Joseph Smith. So this wasn't outsiders being mad about the Mormons. These are ex-members trying to call Joseph Smith out for his bad behavior. They said, "We are earnestly seeking to explode the vicious principles of Joseph Smith and those who practice the same abominations and whoredoms." I also wanted to read this section because they talk about what happens to the women and girls when the prophet asks them to marry him. And I really like that even in the Nauvoo Expositor, which was written in the 1800s, they're actually elevating the story of the women who this is happening to. It says, speaking of the girls who the prophet asks to marry him, "She is thunderstruck, faints, recovers, and refuses. The prophet damns her if she rejects. She thinks of the great sacrifice and of the many thousand miles that she has traveled over sea and land, that she might save her soul from pending ruin, and replies, 'God's will be done and not mine.'" And so in the Nauvoo Expositor, which is published in June 7th, 1844, the prophet is finally fully outed as a polygamist. But it's not the paper that leads to his death. It is Joseph Smith's reaction to the paper, because he basically says that the paper needs to be burned to the ground. And as the mayor of the town, Joseph Smith declares this newspaper as a public nuisance. The Nauvoo City Council, led by Joseph Smith, Smith orders the press should be destroyed, and Joseph Smith's own militia carries out the destruction of the press. At this point, authorities outside of Nauvoo say that Joseph Smith has to be charged for the destruction of the press. And as a response, Joseph Smith declares martial law in Nauvoo and gets his militia together to defend himself. At this point, he's charged with treason. So things escalated really quickly. Basically, the paper is printed, Joseph Smith has it burned to the ground, he's charged for destruction of property, he shuts down his entire city and uses his own little mini army to defend himself, and then he's charged with treason. At this point, the governor of Illinois says that Joseph Smith needs to be charged outside of Nauvoo because he knows that if this trial goes forward in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith will be acquitted, he'll walk away scot-free because everyone in Nauvoo is on Joseph Smith's side. It's at this point that Joseph Smith is imprisoned in Carthage Jail, the same place where I once took a family vacation, and while he's imprisoned, a mob surrounds the jail and breaks through the door, shoots Joseph Smith's brother Hiram, and Joseph Smith falls through a window and is shot in the process and dies. So just to show how quickly this happened, the paper is published on June 7th, and Joseph Smith is killed 20 days later on June 27th. It is absolutely wild to look at the story of Joseph Smith's founding of the Mormon Church and see how he went from this very poor boy living in a poor family, practicing looking through stones to find treasure, to building a city in Illinois with 12,000 people and then being killed in prison for trying to squash the story about how he was secretly marrying 30 to 40 women. I think in all of this, what I hate the most about the story of Joseph Smith's polygamy is that he's the one that still gets the praise. Like, there are still Mormons every Sunday singing praise to the man and reading the Book of Mormon and venerating and honoring this man who destroyed the lives of so many women and girls. I do not think he's the one that deserves to get remembered. And the fact that I didn't know, I knew Emma's name so well. I'd have lessons in Young Women's about how we could be elect women like Emma Smith. And the fact that till I left the Mormon Church, I never heard the name Fanny Alger. I never heard the name Helen Mar Kimball. I never heard of the Lawrence sisters or the Partridge sisters or any of the names I've shared with you all today or their stories. That they've just been consigned to the dustbin of history, except for out of the mouths of people like me, ex-members who want to talk about this stuff. It's such a twisted, dark history. And the idea that out of this story that I've told today, out of these stories that I've told today, comes a religion that prides itself on family values is laughable. And I'll say too, I don't think that members are evil. I don't look back at myself and see myself as this evil person who is totally okay with all of these stories. I see myself as someone who had this reality and this story disappeared from them, completely hidden from them. And the fact that the church only wrote those essays in like 2013, and for over 100 years, they tried so hard to conceal the specifics about Joseph Smith's polygamy. That's why I have so much empathy and compassion for members, is I really don't think that most of them are knowing these stories and being okay with them. I think most of them, if they're just showing up to church on Sunday and never reading a Mormon history book, they will not know these stories. And I think the fault for that lies at the feet of the church and not simply at the feet of the members themselves. I figured I'd end singing praise to the man. I'm going to read the second verse, or sing the second verse. I've obviously sung in previous videos, but I think that here at the end of this video, after I've shared all of this with you, everything that he did to these women and girls, I wanted to sing the song that I grew up singing, just because I think a juxtaposition of who the church says Joseph Smith is and who he actually was is important. So I just tried singing it like 5 times, and my voice is kind of too shot to do the high notes. So I am going to read you the lyrics of the second verse instead. Praise to his memory, he died as a martyr. Honored and blessed be his ever great name. Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, plead unto heaven while the earth lauds his fame. Hail to the prophet ascended to heaven. Traitors and tyrants now fight him in vain. Mingling with gods, he can plan for his brethren. Death cannot conquer the hero again. And so while members wouldn't say they worship Joseph Smith, I'm not sure how you could read these lyrics to praise to the man, mingling with gods, I mean, I'm not sure how you could read this and not see this as like hero worship or just normal worship, but this is the Joseph Smith I was raised with, and I was not raised with the real Joseph Smith. Thank you so much for being here at the end of today's video. I really appreciate anyone who makes it this far, especially on this dark of a story with this many names and dates and details. Thank you for watching, and if you know of someone who might be interested in this video or the information I've shared, please consider sharing it with someone. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. If you hit the bell button, you should get a notification whenever I post. I have a new video basically every single Friday. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you all next week.